Now, we probably should be studying the year 1933, and that's because in that year there were radical changes in governments and in nations around the world, including our own. I tried to advocate for you that in 1933, the valid form of government in the United States toppled due to bankruptcy. And after the bankruptcy, a facsimile type government was put in place, an emergency government, and there it has existed ever since 1933. So most of what you see is drama, because the emergency government is really in charge, and strange things happen, but you don't know how strange things are. So let's take a look at just some of these things on YouTube. And in particular, this is a pretty interesting one here, because I'm not going to show anything, but you can go to them on your own if you like. Here in the United States, supposedly, wealthy businessmen got together in 1933 and contacted a general and wanted to have a coup d'etat, which is a French word coming from the verb to strike or to blow, and it refers to a sudden strike or a sudden blow upon a government. So America's almost coup in 1933. And of course the general informed the proper sources, and it was stopped. It did not occur. Now the reason that supposedly it was going to happen is that businesses and corporations were worried that FDR was going to set up a fascist government. Now, simultaneously, when this is occurring in the United States in 1933, is the rise of Adolf Hitler and what they call the Nazification of the country. And in particular, we'll get into the Enabling Act in Germany that basically gave all power to a dictator in 1933 in Germany. And you have the burning of books in Germany. In the United States, we don't burn books, we just suppress them. And we don't allow students today to look at some of the classical literature that students read and had knowledge of years and years ago. So they're not necessarily burnt, but they're suppressed, and in their place are substituted nonsense, transgender stuff. Now that was in Germany in 1933. I don't know what this is all about, canceling Jimmy Kimmel, the 1933 Nazi playbook. Germany and the rise of Adolf Hitler and the persecution of the Jews is occurring in Europe at this time in 1933. Now for us in the United States, on March the 4th, FDR will take office. And immediately upon taking office, the banks will close. Now isn't that interesting? That as soon as he takes office, the banks are closed. Because supposedly there was a run on the banks. Now I don't believe that at all. But what I do believe is that in 1933, the Federal Reserve System was now going to become the only system that the United States would have. Of course, it takes many, many years. And that's all you have right now is a Federal Reserve System in banking and in your so-called dollars, which are Federal Reserve notes that cannot be redeemed for anything of intrinsic value. Disturbing parallels between 1930s Germany and 2020s USA. Now, one of the parallels that I observed was that in 1929, a large bill came before Senate and was passed and accepted in 1930 to put tariffs on foreign countries. And if you look it up, you'll see that they do not blame the tariffs for the Great Depression, but the consensus is that the tariffs certainly did not help the country. In fact, made the situation worse, because the result was the foreign countries placed on return tariffs upon the tariffs that the U.S. placed. So it made a tariff war in the 30s. You can look that up and you'll see that what I'm telling you is accurate, that the tariffs were placed on foreign producers of goods in around 1930. Remember, this depression started in October, November of 1929. So we have strongest countries in 1933 and the rise of militarism. Of course, you have the famous speeches of Hitler and a lot of Nazi Germany. By the way, a lot of that was faked. Crowds were faked. Faked everything to try to convince everybody that Germany went bonkers over Hitler. Not really. But once again, it's media manipulation, and we're all subject to it. That's why I do my videos, to try to bring us out of some of the media manipulation through the use of media. Okay, here's another video on that. This one's 6 minutes long. The plan in 1933 to overthrow the U.S. government with a military coup. You can do some research on this if you want, which means that something was going on in 1933. Now, what I'm trying to tell you went on was the government just went bankrupt, and that meant that nobody could guarantee anything for the banking system, which was basically just the states supporting banks. There was no Bank of the United States. It was never renewed under Jackson, which, by the way, if you look at your $20 bill, it looks to me like Jackson's head is on a platter. Okay, Berlin, first year in power, so you see the rise of power in Europe, and it might cause you to question about what's going on in the United States. The fall of freedom. Again, everything goes towards Germany, and very little do we talk about the United States. But March the 4th, FDR takes office, 1933, and banks are being closed immediately. Now here's about the World's Fair in 1933 in Chicago, and I remember my mother telling me that as a little girl she actually attended this thing. She was very young, but her parents went to Chicago for the World's Fair in 1933. This is about a massacre that took place in Kansas City at the Union Station. They were transferring prisoners and there was an attempt to rescue the prisoners in a big shootout, and the death of several law enforcement, I believe, in Kansas City. Propaganda is spreading in Germany under Goebbels. And by the way, propaganda has been spreading in our land under the Smith-Mont Modernization Act. Every time I mention it, people refuse to deal with it. But it is true. Propaganda is perfectly acceptable and perfectly legal in the United States, which means there's no source that you can trust for anything. Now, I know everybody wants to proclaim and say, oh, I've got the right station, I've got the right newscasters, I've got the right individual, and you know what? You just go ahead and read it, and you might weep. Most likely you'll dismiss it, and most likely you'll say, that's not true. But it's in there in NDAA 2013, Section 1078. Now they make it sound good. They call it Smith-Mont Modernization Act. They make everything sound good. But it really means is propaganda can be thrown in your face, and mine as well. King Kong is out and going up to the top of Empire State Building. They want to talk about a movie that was banned, and it came from 1933, and what they call the pre-code. Codes were set up in Hollywood to try to get rid of pornography and the vulgarness and anything that was inappropriate. And so there were movies that were put out called pre-code, the Hays Code in Hollywood. But these pre-code movies obviously weren't censored. Incidentally, if you don't know this, but silent movies were not censored in the silent era. But what happened was, as the reel would go from one location to another, the owners of the movie theaters would clip and cut things out because they didn't want it to come into their community. So a lot of the silent films you see have been clipped and cut. Okay, something about a UFO crash in 1933. New Ford in 1933. And here you see the world's powers getting ready to go to a world war. Chamberlain and FDR, right here, FDR and Hitler. Self-parking car in 1933. You might want to check that one out. Now here, this is where we come to what's called the Enabling Act, and this man's presentation I think is a good one. And what it was in Germany, when Hitler was made Chancellor, he basically bypassed the Reichstag, or the group of individuals that would help create the legislation and approve the legislation, and just sort of gave him full power. It enabled him to be a dictator. That was passed in 1933 in Germany. Now Hoover is out of office, and most everyone likes to blame the Great Depression on Herbert Hoover. You ever had a Hoover vacuum? Now they're talking here about the gold confiscation of FDR. It really wasn't a confiscation, as far as I understand it. It was an attempt to recall or turn in the gold. And a lot of this is because the bankruptcy of the United States and then the shifting later into the Federal Reserve System, so that basically the average person doesn't have what you call intrinsic value in coins. So if you had this in your pocket, you had intrinsic value. Now if you have a Federal Reserve note in your pocket, you have no intrinsic value. It's completely dependent upon whether someone around you will accept that piece of paper. And indeed, then that piece of paper gets worth less and less and less. So the gold standard is starting to disappear. And later, the silver standard will disappear, I believe, under Richard Nixon. And 1964 will be the last year in which silver is put into coins. If you understand something about the Constitution, our monetary system is to be based on intrinsic value of coins, not a piece of paper. Incidentally, as I did my paper route when I was a young boy, occasionally, very rarely, I would get what was called a silver certificate dollar. And that was that you had the ability to take that piece of paper to the bank and demand silver for it. So you could get 4 silver quarters. You could get 10 silver dimes. Or you could get 2 silver half dollars. And they were called silver certificates. Those disappeared too, by the way. So nobody can go to the bank and say, I want some gold, I want some silver. All because the monetary system has been made free of intrinsic value, which makes it very easy to control. So here they're going to ask in this little video, how much is a 1933 gold worth? $20, because they were asking them to be turned in. And I think a lot of people have that incorrect. Demanding and confiscating is not correct. It's requesting and asking people to help out by turning in their gold. Wonder what people thought of that, 1933. Turn in your gold. Alrighty, the Invisible Man in 33. Now I tried to do a video on the significance of the number in numerology of 33, and that of course would be the 1/3 of the angelic force following Lucifer in his rebellion against God. You can read of his rebellion if you want in Isaiah chapter 14, and also in a parallel reference you can read of his rebellion and his ways in Ezekiel chapter 28. So 33 is used in witchcraft upon people in many, many ways. Halloween in 1933, the night of the Black Halloween. Here's another one on the plot of 33. This little short of General Butler, and I think I'll play that for you.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. Plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious.
I'm going to have to conclude this. I'd like to thank you for watching and listening in just to a casual video about 1933.